And then you think, well, what are you sacrificing to get married? Well, let's think about it. What are you sacrificing? Foolish, juvenile, short-sighted, hedonistic, nihilist, cynical, psychopathic, impulsive promiscuity. That's what you're sacrificing. It's like, hey, you might want to sacrifice that because that sounds like a pretty decent collection of demons, and you probably don't want that cluttering up your life. It's what, you're going to be Peter Pan, King of the Lost Boys, you're never going to grow up. It's like, what grows you up? Responsibility, sacrifice, a vision of the future. And so people grow up when they get married, and it's probably better to get married when you're young, because then you grow up. And then what else matures people? I've met very few people who have fully matured who don't have children. And I think there's a reason for that, a technical reason. You are not mature until someone else matters more than you. Period. And maybe that will be your wife or your husband, but probably not. They might matter as much as you, and maybe that's the right amount. But when you have children, they matter more than you, unless there's something seriously wrong with you. Very few parents, if push came to shove, wouldn't die for their children. And as soon as someone else matters more than you do in some fundamental sense, you've taken another step towards a true, mature responsibility. And I don't see that you can do that without necessity. And there's nothing that screams necessity more than an infant. So what? So you don't want to grow up. You want to stay a child. You want to stay an adolescent. Really, you want to stay an adolescent. Do you know anyone more miserable than a teenager? Why would you want to stay that? How is that possible? And maybe you say, I want to stay a child. Well, first of all, you're not supposed to stay a child. You're supposed to become a child. That's a whole different thing. You're supposed to take all that wisdom of maturity, all that hard-earned knowledge, even the cynicism and the skepticism, the monstrosity that comes with being aggressive, all of that. You're supposed to transmute that into the spirit of play that inhabited you when you were a child. But you're not supposed to stay immature. That's not helpful, because a 3-year-old, who's a delightful creature, cannot rule the household, much less the state. You have to grow up. You grow up to return to childhood. And that's the doorway into the domain of paradise. And you do that in the spirit of play. And you do that within the confines of your marriage. And the marriage should be, and this is true particularly on the sexual front, I would say, that should be the highest possible form of play. And so that is so valuable. It's so utterly valuable that all that idiocy and immaturity that you're sacrificing, it's like cutting away dead flesh. It's like burning old clothes, or it's the forest fire that renews the garden. There's no sacrifice in that. If you think that what you're giving up isn't worth what you're attaining, then your vision is clouded to a degree that's a form of miracle. And it's the same with having children. It's like, well, what the hell are you going to do with your life? You've got a job and a career. You've got your wife or your husband. You've got your kids. That's what you've got. And you can sacrifice one of those, and maybe if you're like Einstein, career is enough. If you're Einstein, career is enough. You're probably not Einstein. And so you need all three of those, and why wouldn't you want to have them? You have children and a family and a stable life and a productive life and a generous life and a playful life, and then later you have grandchildren. And so what else are you going to do when you're 60? By yourself in your isolated hedonism. And what sort of sex object are you going to be then for your hedonistic promiscuity? That's no plan. You know, I know already that if you're still an adolescent by the time you're 40, you're a creep. You're the sort of person that you don't even want to be around. So you don't want to be the oldest person at the frat party. That is not pretty. There's something rotten about that. And I mean in that contemptible sense. It's something that's overstayed its welcome, man. And, you know, people are willing to forgive your immaturity when you're 22 or 23 or 28 maybe, or even 30. But, man, if you're still playing that game when you're 40, you are not a happy person. And you're going to be motivated to go out there and make everyone miserable. And so grow the hell up. And why? Well, why? Because it's better in every way. It's better for you. It's better for your wife or your husband, obviously. It's way better for your children. If your family's together, that's better for your community. And then maybe, if you've got your family together, you could go serve the community a bit in some positive sense. And that would be good for the community and the state and the country. It all scaffolds up from there. Why is that not a good thing? I don't know why there's lots of alternative forms of family. It's like, no, not really. There are deviations from the ideal that need to be dealt with mercy and justice. But the bloody core is pretty clear, and that's monogamous heterosexuality. And we deviate from that by necessity at our peril. And I don't see any evidence to the contrary for that whatsoever. And if you think you can come up with a better solution, I suppose you're entitled to implement it in your own life. But maybe you could go a little easy on the insistence that the bloody, stable, foundational structures of organization and society have to be retooled for your convenience. That's a bad idea. And it's narcissistic to the core. If you're an eccentric and an oddball and a creative person, perhaps more power to you. But you should be grateful that an exception is allowed to be made for you. And you should do everything you possibly can to make yourself so productive and remarkable that people think, yeah, well, he bent the rules, but all things considered, it was worth it. And that's the price you should pay for your deviance, let's say. You see marriages sometimes that are pretty broken. And so there's a good predictor of a broken marriage for those of you who are listening. If you're a marriage counselor and you're talking to a couple and while they're talking, one of them or the other or both rolls their eyes, there's an extremely high probability that they're going to get divorced, because that eye rolling is a marker of contempt. And the worst emotion you can feel in relationship to someone else isn't fear, it's contempt. Contempt is a disgust-related emotion. And you just get rid of disgusting things. You burn them, you destroy them. There's no mercy given to something contemptible. And so if your marriage has got to the point where you can't communicate without the expression of contempt, it's pretty damn hard to come back from there. Analogous, I suppose, is the problem of infidelity. You make bedrock assumptions when you move into a marriage, and we're bound together in love and truth, for better or worse, till death do us part. And there's a sexual propriety element to that, which is a symbol of the commitment, a symbol of the seriousness with which this relationship is to be regarded. And when that's violated, it's a constitutional crisis. It's like the fundamental bedrock of the relationship has been destroyed. And the question then is, can you recover from that? And the answer is, it depends on your ability to negotiate. Like, there's no clear path forward from that kind of violation. Now, the alternative, which is the dissolution of the relationship, might also be too dreadful to apprehend. And maybe that's not necessary, but I would say you need something like a genuine renewal of your vows. So let's say the person who's wronged has to go and think, and here's what they have to think about. The first thing would be, is it even possible for me to forgive this person, or am I going to hang this over their head and mine for the rest of my life? That's a really serious question, because the answer to that might be, I can't forgive this. I don't know how to forgive this. That could easily be the answer. And then the question might be, can I find a way to forgive this? And that's a real genuine question too. And then the next question would be, what would have to occur hypothetically for me to forgive this? And how could we test that out? And it would be something like confession and repentance, because that's the classic pattern of redemption. And so the other person who strayed is going to have to explain why. And that's a deep explanation, right? It goes all the way to the bottom because they violated their most fundamental vow. So they've messed everything up. And so the confession has to be something like, well, how did it come about that you're so screwed up that you messed everything up? And there's a lot of confessing that has to go along with that. And my suspicions are, if the person who violated the vow confessed deeply enough, the other person would then understand, and out of that understanding would come forgiveness. But the confession would have to be proportionate in depth to the depth of the insult. And that really means all the way down to the bloody bottom. And then the other person who's been transgressed against also has to go away and think, well, What stupid things did I do to make it more likely that I'd be cheated on? Is there ever 100% a perpetrator and 100% a victim? Is there ever someone who's 100% tyrant and someone who's 100% innocent? Well, maybe you see that in the figure of Christ, but if you're not Christ, it probably doesn't apply to you. So if you're in trouble, probably you did something to increase the probability that you're in that kind of trouble. And so, maybe every time your partner was interested in some kind of sexual escapade, you put up 5 barriers. This is something husbands do to their wives. Let's say that you've married some woman that is pretty attractive and you can't figure out for the life of you why the hell she picked you. So you got fortunate enough so you chose above your market value. And so you have this attractive wife. And now, because you're insecure about your own utility, and maybe for good reasons, you're jealous. And so then you're going to go out on a date for dinner and she has bought a new dress and she puts it on and she looks pretty damn sharp, and you notice that it annoys you because you think other people will find her attractive, and so you say, how much did you spend on that? And she deflates, and that's good for you because you've punished her for her stupidity in choosing you, and you've let her know in no uncertain terms that she's not to be attractive to other men because they might steal her. And you do that to her like 30 times and she won't dress up anymore, and she'll gain 20 pounds just to spite you, which is exactly what you bloody deserve. And she'll turn into a housemaid, and then you can whine to all your friends about how the woman you married is nowhere near you anymore, and you'll fail to observe that that was 100% your doing. And so then when she goes off and has an affair, you can sit on your bed and you can think, oh yeah, remember when she bought that dress and I insulted her about the money? When what I should have said is, oh my God, you look so sharp. More of that. More of that. Better dresses. More attractiveness. It's like, you want to hurt someone. Here's how to do it. You wait and you watch, and you wait till they come out of their shell a bit and do something good. Just as a little experiment, and that shames you because now they're doing something good and you're not. So then, as soon as you see that emerge, you whack it. And you do that. You can train a dog to starve itself to death by hitting it on the nose with a newspaper when it approaches its food bowl. If you do that 20 times, the dog will starve to death. And Nietzsche said we're best punished for our virtues. It's like, man, you can do that in a marriage, especially if you're jealous and envious, especially of the good part of your partner. You're playing Cain to their Abel. They put themselves out, they do something spectacular, they move ahead in a way that puts you in a dim light comparatively, and you stab them. And you don't think you do that. It's like, you better do some more thinking, because the chances that you do that are pretty much 100%. And so when you're in the dismal situation that your partner has cheated on you, in thought or deed, then you might ask yourself, yeah, well, and just what did I do to deserve this? And so then the partner who cheated can come and say, well, this is the depth of idiocy that characterizes my hell-possessed mind, and this is why I cheated, and I'm pretty bloody, appallingly pathetic in 50 different ways. And the person who's cheated on might be able to say, yeah, well, that sucks, and I hope you don't do it again, but I can kind of understand why it happened. And maybe you can swear not to do it again. And here's some things I might have done along the way to make you even more stupid than you might already be. And can we see our way forward? And then you have a discussion. Well, we have kids, we have a house, we have a life. Is there good in this? Can it be salvaged? Can we recommit? Maybe you have to get married again. Who the hell knows what ceremony of expiation might be necessary, but none is hardly the answer. And then you have to swear by everything that's holy that you don't commit the same bloody error, or at least maybe that if you're tempted to stray, maybe you'll say something about it this time. And then maybe you can thread that needle and move forward. It's pretty rough in the case of infidelity, but that happens. And I don't know if you want to burn the whole bloody thing to the ground on the basis of that error, cataclysmic as though it might be, because you're stepping out of one hell into another. And that's something we could talk about in relationship to divorce. It's pretty damn hard to get divorced once you have kids, because you're stuck with that person for the rest of your life. And so are your kids. And so you're still going to have to negotiate with them. And then you get divorced, well, you still have a relationship with the person you're getting divorced from, except now it's not you and him or you and her, it's you and him or her and some social workers and a bunch of lawyers and some judges. And if you think they're going to make your life any easier than the marriage was, you haven't been through a difficult custody battle. And I would say to all of those of you who don't know this yet, that a difficult custody battle is probably equivalent to a near fatal bout of cancer. It is not good. And so you enter into divorce at your peril. And maybe you're smart enough to negotiate it out peacefully, but you couldn't do it when you were married. And hypothetically, you loved each other. So what makes you think you're going to be able to do it now that you're getting divorced? Now, some people manage it and negotiate. It's rare, but it happens, and thank God. And more power to them, you know. Sometimes you have to make a dramatic transformation and move on, but it's not optimal and it's not ideal. And, you know, you hear these ideas, marriage should be more difficult and divorce easier. It's like, no, that's exactly backwards. It's an anti-truth. Especially once you have kids. I found the love of my life and I'm going to live happily ever after. Okay, first of all, who cares about you? Why is this about you? I don't understand why this is about you. Maybe it's about your wife or your husband. I want to find the person right for me. How do I find the person right for me? I can imagine hardly a more narcissistic statement than that. It's like, how do I transform myself into the ideally desirable partner? That's a way better question. And then on the marriage front, it's like, well, I want to be happy. I want to have the person that's right for me. It's not about you. It's about your partner. Now, it's also about you insofar as that's necessary for the relationship to be optimized. It's about your partner. You try to serve them. I try to say yes to my wife every time I can say yes when she asks something. We have an agreement. It's like, if I can say yes to you, I will. If you can say yes to me, do. Because then we both get what we need and want. And I'm assuming you're not going to ask me things that are inappropriate or unworthy. And we extend that courtesy to each other. And then we can have what we want. But once you have kids, it's not about you or your partner. It's about the kids. And so people say, well, we stayed together for the sake of the kids. And it's sort of a defeat. And yeah, that's not optimal. But, you know, there's some nobility in that. You have the damn kids. You already made the decision. It's not about you anymore. I say that. You have to understand. I say all that. Many of my family members have been divorced. You know, I mean, I understand the difficulty of attaining that stellar ideal. And I understand the necessity of a reservoir of mercy around the ideal. But by the same token, the ideal should not be sacrificed. And the notion that heterosexual, stable monogamy is the ideal, it's like, yep, that's the ideal. And so it's a sacrifice that, if done properly, is incomparably worthwhile. It gives you your life. You know, I've had a stellar career, I would say. But I would say that even though I've had a stellar career, and I've known many people who have had stellar careers, it's by no means obvious to me that any of that has been more important or even of equivalent significance to the relationships I've had with my wife and my children. You know, young women are taught that career will be the most important thing in their lives. And I don't get that at all, because part of the feminist mantra is the pathology of the patriarchy. And so why we would train as feminists young women to be superlative agents of the patriarchy is completely beyond me. I don't understand that a bit, unless you assume that if the patriarchy is now full of women, it's somehow no longer a patriarchy. And that's utterly foolish, because the patriarchy inheres in the hierarchical structure and not in the fact of masculinity, especially given that women who occupy job and career roles are taking on a masculine aspect. So all of that's preposterous. So, like, is that the most important thing in life? Well, not for the vast majority of men, and possibly all of them, and absolutely certainly not for the vast majority of women. And that's as brute a fact as there is. And so, why? Well, women do value men for their socially productive generosity. And they value men for that because they have to make themselves vulnerable to become pregnant and to take care of infants. So they're looking for someone who can provide to fill that gap. And that's perfectly appropriate, practically, rationally, biologically, and from an evolutionary perspective. Men do not value women for the same reason. And the data on that are absolutely clear. So men have an extra kick to job and career success, is that it also comes with attractiveness to women. But women don't have that because that doesn't make them more attractive to men. And you can flip that around any way you want, but it's a brute fact. It might be the brute fact of heterosexual relationships. Men have other reasons for choosing women. And they're not as choosy as women, and that is not an insult to women, by the way. So that's just how it is. But one of the consequences of that is that the rewards attendant psychologically and practically on career success are higher for men, especially at the upper echelons of the accomplishment distribution. And then women are more interested in people than men, and men are more interested in things. And so what that also means is that women find more fulfillment in intimate interpersonal relationships. And you think, well, that's all cultural. It's like, you don't know what you're talking about. It's not all cultural. How do we know that? Because the biggest difference we've ever found between men and women isn't in personality, although there are differences there, it's in interest. And women are reliably more interested in people, and men are reliably more interested in things. And those differences get bigger in egalitarian societies. And so if you leave women to their own devices, they tilt towards interpersonal relationships. Now, is that really so shocking to everyone? And if you leave men alone, well, they're gadget-oriented and thing-oriented and machine-oriented. And some men are exceptionally that way. Engineers are particularly that way. There's even pathologies that are associated with that. There are different syndromes associated with different extremes of interest, and autism seems to be associated with a hyper-thing orientation. Autistic people often have very much difficulty with interpersonal relationships. In any case, these are big differences. And so there's an element of the male obsession with productive generosity, so career, let's say, that spurs on male achievement, especially at the upper echelons, in a manner that does not produce commensurate rewards for women. And I know that theoretically, but I also know it practically. I dealt with really high achieving women for a long time, partly as graduate students in great universities. And then I worked for big law firms. They would send me their best people, their most productive, socially able rainmakers, the people who could make the social arrangements necessary to generate business and to practice law. Very high level of attainment. A lot of them were women. And they hit the partnership level in big law firms when they're about 30. And that requires dedication at the level of about 80 hours a week of solid, flat out, bloody, non-stop effort to be competitive at that level. And the law firms would lose all their women in their early 30s. Because the women who were hyper-conscientious would hit partnership, which is what they were aiming at, and they were like, man, dead-eye dedicated to that from the time they're like 14. And so they hit it, and then they look around, they think, oh my God, I'm surrounded by hyper-competitive men who work 80 hours a week and who are going to do that for the next 40 years. And why would anyone do that? And that's the question. It's like, well, do you want to work 80 hours a week? Now, personally, speaking for myself, I would work 80 hours a week no matter where you put me. You could put me in the middle of the forest and I would work 80 hours a week. I'm wired that way, and some people are wired that way. But it isn't for everyone, that's for sure. And you have to ask yourself why you do it. Well, you do that because that's what you're like. That's your temperament. It's very rare among women. They want a marriage. They want a family. They want intimate relationships. And they want a balance between that and career. And I'm not putting down the necessity of career for women. First of all, women are half the creative capacity and the industrious capacity of the human race. We want to have access to that, man. These law firms, they wanted to keep these women. They bend over backwards to keep them, but they couldn't. The women would all go and find an 8-hour-a-day job. Often it paid much less because they usually had husbands too that made a lot of money. And so they could do that, and then they'd have a life. It's like, that seems appropriate. Have your family, have your relationship, have your career, that's necessary. It's necessary for women to go out and have their productive social adventure. And then all that has to be negotiated within the confines of a marriage too. It's like, whose career comes first when push comes to shove, or is there a way we can negotiate around that? And that all has to be sorted out carefully. So we could sum up a bit. So what does marriage offer on the sacrificial side? Well, the eradication of the useless encumbrances of childhood immaturity and adolescent impulsivity and venality. That all goes. Well, if you're going to grow up, and you should because it's better, then that's a sacrifice worth making. What else do you lose? Well, you lose the plethora of possibility that all alternative mates offer. But that's a lot more fun in the contemplation than in the actuality. First of all, most people have very limited access to a pool of potential mates, often because of the choice of those potential mates. And so the plenitude is there more in the contemplation than in the reality. And then even if you do have indefinite access, as some people do, what you have then is a series of extraordinarily shallow, hedonistic, short-term, promiscuous interactions which are not good for your character development and certainly not good for the people that you're imposing yourself upon, let's say. And so that's what you sacrifice. Well, that seems well worth dispensing with. And then what do you gain? Well, you gain the opportunity to practice loving somebody, and then maybe you could get better at that with everyone. You get the opportunity to practice figuring out what you want and need and communicating that. You get the practice of telling the truth. You get to set up a home. Probably want a home. Most people want a home. You get to optimize your sex life and your intimate life. You get to have someone with you through the trials of your life. You get to be there for someone through the trials of their life. You get to lay down a platform for having children. Then you get to have children. And then if you're good with your children and you two sensibly negotiate your disciplinary strategies so that you don't let your children do things that make you hate them, then you have children that you love. And then they grow up and they have grandchildren that you love. And then you're surrounded by people who love you. And then you have that continuity of memory and identity that goes along with your partnership. And then you have the self-respect that goes along with having made the sacrificial gesture properly and having borne your responsibilities nobly. And then you're a credit to yourself and your wife and your family, and then maybe to your community and the broader world. And so that seems like a good deal.